Now, let us look at the South Korean policies of ODA. I told you that the South Korea used to be a ODA recipient from all over the world. Let me introduce some simple statistics. How much money came to South Korea after 1945 until now. In the period between 1945 and 1960, the grants and loans, totally $3 billion flowed to South Korea. And in the period between 1961 to 75, $3.9 billion as grants or loans. And between 1976 and 1990, $3.9 billion. From 1991 to 1990, $2 billion. So totally from the 1945 to 1990, for about 55 years, $12.7 billion flowed to South Korea. As I mentioned, South Korea used to be a recipient of ODA, but later South Korea joined the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, DAC, in the year 2009. But already South Korea started to help developing countries as early as 1976, 77, because it achieved the rapid economic development. Again, South Korea, for the first time in the world, transformed from the ODA recipient to a donor to developing countries. Let's see the amount of ODA which the South Korean government spends from the year 2008 to the present. In the year 2008, South Korea spent $800 million. It was the 0.09% of its GNI. And 2 years later, $1.2 billion, and which was the 0.12% of GNI. 2 years later, $1.6 billion, 0.14%. And 5 years later, $22 billion, 0.16%. And now, $2.5 billion and 0.15%. So currently, South Korea spends 0.15% of GDP to the ODA, which is much lower than the ceiling which the United Nations recommends. As a middle power, South Korea has an obligation to spend more on the ODA to developing countries. If you look at this graph, the UN target is 0.7% of GNI. And South Korea locates over here. And over the 0.7% in Sweden, Norway, Luxembourg, Denmark, and Germany. These 5 countries are spending over 0.7% of GNI to ODA. But as far as the absolute volume-wise, Korea locates over here, probably 18th largest ODA spender in the world. Again, Korea as a middle power should spend increase of its ODA to the percentage of to the ceiling of 0.7% of GNI as early as possible. What about the Korean ODA to ASEAN countries? Because I'm telling you this because there's a clear bias of Korean ODA, the so-called regional bias. In other words, most of the South Korean ODA goes to Asian countries. So Asian countries receive more than 55% of the Korean ODA every year. Particularly these three countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, and the Philippines. These are statistics of 2013. I couldn't find the recent data from many internet sources. Obviously, this is the Vietnam, and among other other Asian countries, Vietnam receives the most of the ODA from South Korea. And Vietnam and Cambodia and Philippines. Look at this, the increasing trend of ODA of South Korea to Vietnam. Obviously, Vietnam was an enemy during the Vietnam War because South Korea participated into the Vietnam War as a chief ally in Asia. And so it was a hostile relationship between South Korea and Vietnam. But after the collapse of the Cold War, two countries normalized its relations, and now Vietnam is the third largest trade partner for South Korea. And for Vietnam, South Korea is the second largest trade partner. And Vietnam is importing many intermediary goods or parts from South Korea, and Vietnam assembled them within Vietnam and export all these finished goods to all over the world, particularly to the United States. So currently, Vietnam emerges an important trading partner for the United States. The reason why I said South Korea should increase its ODA spending is the fact that the foreign reserves of South Korea is not small. It's quite a lot. So let me introduce the foreign reserves by countries in the early 2020. Obviously, China has the largest foreign reserves and $3.1 trillion. Extremely high. Japan is second largest foreign reserve country, $1.4 trillion. And Russia is third, $568 billion. And India, Taiwan, South Africa, Hong Kong, and South Korea, almost similar here. And South Korean foreign reserves were $411 billion in the early 2022. And next is Brazil. So I think that South Korea has enough kept the foreign reserves. So South Korea has a full responsibility to support developing countries in Asia as well as in other continents. So I think South Korea should, as early as possible, increase its ODA to the level of the 0.7 of GNI as the UN recommended.